The last few days around my quote suburban homestead have been really busy. This week I am sharing with you a number of things that I did over the course of a few days. A sourdough discard carrot cake, freeze drying vegetables to make sure we are good to go when food preservation season arrives, a 2024 garden update, seasoning cast iron pans and getting that rust off of them, fertilizing seedlings before transplanting them, and freeze drying some convenience food. Over the last few days, I have been squeezing in spring homemaking tasks that can help me get ahead of the game. Really, I'm trying to enjoy spring homemaking before it becomes too much or overwhelming. I know that we're still a little ways off from summer break for school and all the festivities and activities of summer, but the reality is that's going to be here really quickly. And if I don't prep for that now, it is a lot for me to handle when it comes to running my home, growing a garden, preserving food, and doing all the things that I like to do while building and creating this suburban homestead-ish lifestyle. At the end of 2023, we invested in a Harvest Right freeze dryer. If you want to learn more about that freeze dryer, you can check out the link in the description box below. But at the end of 2023, when we bought this, of course, there was nothing growing and we didn't really get a chance to try preserving our homegrown food. So I am freeze drying onions, carrots, and celery. So there's a couple reasons why I'm doing this. It's important to note that when you get a freeze dryer, it seems like it's just this cut and dry sort of thing, but there is a little bit of a learning curve to it. So I want to make sure that I know exactly how to freeze dry vegetables and preserve them before I grow them. I'd rather mess up some store-bought stuff than my homegrown stuff. So that's one reason why I'm doing this. But the other reason that I am preserving or freeze drying these vegetables is because I want some quick, already chopped up, ready to go foods for when things start to get a little bit busier. I'll share more about the freeze drying process toward the end of this video, so you can fast forward if you want to, but later I will be making some freeze dried mashed potatoes. But before we talk about vegetables, can we just talk about cake? Look, it's a carrot cake. It has vegetables in it, and it's really delicious. So this sourdough discard carrot cake recipe is available on my website at moonandmagnolia.com. This is a really classic carrot cake recipe, and here are my adjustments on my really fancy piece of brown paper grocery bag. So here's the deal with this carrot cake. It is a classic carrot cake that I have adapted into a sourdough discard carrot cake. You can adapt just about any recipe to include sourdough discard with a really easy formula. Determine how much sourdough discard you want to use. I usually use about 100 grams when I'm adapting a recipe because I usually have about 100 grams of extra starter. So decide how much starter you want to use and divide that by 2. So in this case, that is 50. Then you will subtract that number, 50, from both the flour and the liquid ingredients. That's because your starter has both flour and liquid in it. And I should note that this is under the assumption that your starter hydration is at 100%, meaning you feed it equal parts flour and equal parts water. If you're listening to this and you're like, I don't do math, I do girl math. Good news. We don't do girl math around here. We just do math. You've totally got this. So take the grams of starter, divide that by 2. That number you subtract from the flour and the liquid. So I'll share with you those adjustments one more time just to make sure we're clear. So in my case, I used 100 grams of starter. I then subtracted 50 grams of flour from the recipe and 50 grams of liquid, which I took out of the oil. This recipe calls for oil and butter, so reducing the 50 grams from the oil worked out just fine. Otherwise, you make this like you would any other cake. So I mixed together the dry ingredients and the wet ingredients and then combined them. A few other things I changed about this recipe compared to other carrot cake recipes. I reduced the nutmeg, one that's out of personal preference, but I often feel like there's just a little bit too much spice in carrot cake. I want to taste the carrots and the sweetness, not always the spice. So I kept the cinnamon about normal, but I did reduce the nutmeg, and I also made the icing a little less sweet. It is a cream cheese icing, and it's really good. Really, really good, by the way. But I did reduce it by 1 cup of powdered sugar to balance the flavors. I am folding in the shredded carrots. So these I shredded with a box grater. I would not recommend using store-bought pre-shredded carrots because they're too dry. You could use a food processor, but honestly, you only have to shred like 3 carrots, so it's probably more work just to bust that thing out and then clean it. So I'd recommend just hand shredding them on a box grater. Then I am putting the batter into a greased and floured cake pan. This is a new cake pan that I just got from Williams-Sonoma, so I've only used it once so far, and so far so good, but I guess the jury is still out. And I'm baking this at 350 until a toothpick comes out clean. which depending on your oven is about 45 to 50 minutes. Mine was closer to 50. Then while the cake is cooling, I am just making the icing. This is a stick of butter, a block of cream cheese, vanilla, and 3 cups of powdered sugar combined. Once the cake is done, I like to let it rest in the pan for about 10 to 15 minutes just so I can handle it, and then turn it out onto a wire rack to cool. Once it's totally cool, you can ice it. Just don't ice it before because it can melt your frosting. I think this cake is best the next day. It's very good the same day, but man, when that thing is cold the next morning with a cup of coffee, it is so good. You can grab this recipe over on moonandmagnolia.com. I will leave the link for that in the description box below. But in case you're wondering what this has to do with suburban homesteading, pretty much nothing other than I can't stress enough to make sure you are doing things that you enjoy and eating things that you love, because more work is waiting for us outside in the garden. So our spring 2024 garden update. We are expanding our garden about 3 times the size, and my husband has built these beds and is doing a process called Sourdough to help preserve the wood and make it last longer. We also added a greenhouse, which is almost finished. Prior to this, we had 4 4x4 raised gardens that came from a box kit from Costco. We built them in 2020 and they were spent. So not only was it time to replace them, it's just time to upgrade because the way we are living our lives has changed over the last few years. My daughter and I planted peas in our green stalk, and if you have a limited garden space, I cannot emphasize enough how helpful a green stalk is because you're growing up and you can plant a lot of plants in those pockets. So hopefully those will work out. We'll see. It's already getting pretty hot here, but let's talk about my seedling update. I am not a gardening expert, so I've been doing a little reading online about how to help my seedlings because some of them seem like they're not doing super great. And I read that using a fish emulsion or fish fertilizer can help them because when you plant the seeds, they have enough nutrients in them to actually germinate. But once they start to grow leaves or true leaves, they need nutrition because they no longer have their own. So you really need to fertilize them because potting soil does not have any fertilizer or nutrition in it. I have never fertilized my seeds before, so I don't exactly know what I'm doing. So I diluted the fish fertilizer to half strength just to make sure I don't mess them up. And you might think it's a little gross to fertilize my plants in my kitchen, but first of all, I can sterilize my kitchen. And secondly, my threshold for gross has really changed since having a child. In fact, my child vomited all over my hair in a restaurant recently, and I had to wash my hair in a public sink. So, I'm just really not that worried about some fish fertilizer. When we are talking about getting things done and managing all the tasks that we have, I think it's really important to do it in a way that works for you. And so if that means planting seeds in your kitchen or fertilizing your seedlings in your kitchen, if that works for you, then do it. I am also thinning my peppers, so I'm not fertilizing these yet because they just started to grow their true leaves and some of them don't even have their true leaves yet. So I'm going to wait a little bit longer to fertilize these. If you know a lot about gardening and seedlings, feel free to leave any tips in the comments below because this is something I'm trying to figure out. And a few of you have reached out to me mentioning you're trying to learn this too, so feel free to share your ideas. A few things I learned so far this year is to make sure you know how tall the seedlings will get because I ran into an issue where my bunny tail grass got really tall, my other seedlings were really short, so the bunny tail grass started to burn on the tops from the lights, and then when I moved the lights up, my shorter seedlings started to get leggy, so that was a little bit of a mess, but lesson learned for next time. Okay, another thing I'm trying to work on as we move into spring and busier days where I really just want to spend more time outside, and soon there will be no school, so I have to manage having a 3-year-old running around while doing all this stuff too, is I'm trying to get back into the habit of meal prep and homemade convenience food. So I try to make some freezer meals, but I do tend to shy away from freezer meals in the summer because I live in southeastern North Carolina and we are a prime target for hurricanes. So every year we get a hurricane and every year we lose our power. A few years ago, most of our town lost power for about 2 weeks. And when that happens, of course, all your food is wasted. So I am trying to freeze dry some convenience food. So I'll be freeze drying some mashed potatoes with you. And I'm also just getting back into the habit of making a whole chicken at the beginning of every week. I really like to make roasted chicken because I think the meat tastes really good that way, and then you can boil the bones for bone broth. But recently I was watching From Scratch Farmstead. That's a great YouTube channel if you want to check that out. She has really good, easy recipes. And she was talking about making a chicken once a week, which is something I usually do too, but I kind of fell out of practice for a while. But she recommended slow cooking it because that way you get the broth and the chicken all at the same time. And that's a really great idea for busy days. So in my Dutch oven, I am combining a whole chicken. I'm filling it up, I'd say a little over halfway with water, adding a little apple cider vinegar. I heard that this can help draw the minerals out of the bones. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's not going to hurt, so I'll just do it. And some salt. Now I bring that to a boil on my stovetop, and then I actually use my proofing box to do this because the Broden Taylor proofing box doubles as a slow cooker. So you just take out the tray and the water tray and switch it over to slow cook mode and set it to 195. The temperature is a little hard to see there, but 195 is the standard temperature for a low setting on any crock pot or slow cooker. And now that the chicken is boiling, I'm very carefully transferring it into the proofing box or slow cooker. Then just put the cast iron lid on, or the lid to whatever pot you're using, and then the lid to the proofing box on, and you can let it sit there for 8, 10, 12 hours, whatever works for your schedule. Then at one time, you have really good broth. I do agree with From Scratch Farmstead. The broth tastes better when it's cooked this way. And then you also have meat. So you could freeze the broth, you could freeze the meat, you could can the broth and eat the meat, however you want to do it. We actually just ended up eating all of this during this week, but getting back into the habit of this is helpful. I also noticed recently that some of my cast iron is getting a little rusted from cleaning it and wear and tear. Because cast iron does rust, that's normal, it's not a problem, it just needs to be cleaned up and re-seasoned. I have a full YouTube tutorial about how to care for and use cast iron. I'll link that in the description box below. But in that, I mentioned that I don't really think the oven method, which I'm doing today, is great for seasoning cast iron, and I still maintain and contend that that is true. I don't think that seasoning cast iron in the oven is great to make a non-stick seasoning for coating, but it's really good to get started and to repair rusty spots. To do this, you'll just need to give your cast iron a good scrub. Now the rust on my cast iron is pretty minimal, so I don't need like a really abrasive sponge. I'm just using an old Scrub Daddy, and I'm washing it with soap and water and scrubbing that rust off, rinsing all the soap off, and then drying it really well. It's really important that you dry it totally, because soon I'm putting oil on it and you don't want the oil to sit on top of the water. So make sure it's bone dry before seasoning it. So once everything is washed up and ready to go, I am coating in a very thin layer of oil. So you can use any type of oil you prefer here. I like to use a neutral oil. I was a little shocked at how expensive avocado oil was at Costco recently. So I am using canola oil here. I know there's a lot of feelings about canola oil and cooking with it, but I do like to season with it because other oils are really expensive and I'm not eating this. I'm basically just using it to create a nonstick surface, but you should use whatever oil you are comfortable with and that works within your budget. And I'm using a paper towel just to spread that oil around. You don't want the oil to be too thick, because then when you put it in the oven, it will get kind of sticky and thick, and you just really want a nice thin coating of that oil. So once everything is oiled up and ready to go, I'd like to put either a cookie sheet or a piece of foil underneath of the cast iron just to catch anything that might drip. And then you bake these at 500 degrees for an hour. When the hour is up, turn the oven off, but leave the cast iron in the oven and allow it to sit there as long as it needs to come all the way back down to room temperature. Make sure you're not doing this on a day when you need to use your oven right away, because it does take a while for that hot cast iron to cool off and get back to room temperature. And you can see here that after putting it in the oven, they look great. It has that patina look, that glossy black look that we go for with cast iron. The bottom of my skillet is dirty because I have used it since, but the rust is gone. Really, the best way to season your cast iron for cooking is to cook in it. But if you need to restore it a little bit, or if the handle needs a little bit of seasoning, for example, if you notice some rust, using the oven method works just fine. Seasoning cast iron is not a high on my priority list in the middle of spring when I'm getting my garden together, or later during food preservation season. I mean, of course, if it needs to be done, I'll do it, but I'd like to get that stuff done ahead of time so I don't have to worry about it later when I'm busy doing other things. As I mentioned before, I try not to get too heavy with the freezer foods this time of year because hurricane season is on the way. So what I'm experimenting with now is freeze drying convenience foods. Now, I am freeze drying mashed potatoes. You might think like, I thought this was a spring video. Spring is not mashed potato time. Spring, winter, summer, fall, and everywhere in between, they're all mashed potato times. I love mashed potatoes. So I am making freeze-dried mashed potatoes so that way I have instant potatoes whenever I want them. Because this is my first time freeze drying mashed potatoes, I just kept things really simple. I didn't want to waste too much food in case it didn't work out. But all you do is cook your potatoes like you normally would, mash them. You can add in whatever ingredients you want. So I just added milk and enough to get them to mash up. But if you're really into like milk, butter, salt, ranch, whatever it is you like in your mashed potatoes, you can make them however you want. Then you simply take your potatoes and you spread them on the freeze drying trays. Now, when you're freeze drying, it's really important to make sure that the layer or the thickness of the food is about equal on all the trays. And you also want to make sure that the food does not go above the edge of the tray, because if it does, it could hit the inside of the freeze dryer and then you have some like gnarly and funky food all over the inside of your freeze dryer. Also, in case you're wondering, yes, I changed my shirt because it is hot in my kitchen with the seasoning the cast iron and then making the potatoes. We are already into unbearably hot kitchen season here in southeastern North Carolina. So normally I get the freeze dryer cooling and then I get all the food in the trays, but the mashed potatoes were still a little warm, so I did this in a different order. So I got everything on the trays first, so that way it was thin and can cool. And now I'm starting up the freeze dryer. So you just hit the power button and then make sure that the valve is closed. So you just make sure that that valve is perpendicular to the drain line. The machine will remind you to do all these things, and then you give it 15 minutes to cool off. Then when it's ready, I just loaded up the trays right into the freeze dryer, close the door, hit go, and that is it. And the next day they're done. So we put them in a jar, and then all you have to do is add hot water and you have a homemade mashed potatoes. I love the busyness of spring and getting back into the garden, and I really love the busyness of summer, getting into food preservation and having tons of fun outside, but I don't always want to layer or compound that with a bunch of homemaking tasks. So I'm trying to do bite-sized pieces of things here and there that can get the work done now so I can have more fun later.